The scream that tore through the Silver Ridge mine on that scorching August afternoon in 1878 would haunt Thomas Fairmont for the rest of his days, though not for the reasons anyone might expect. He had been watering his horse near the entrance when the earth itself seemed to roar, a terrible grinding thunder that sent birds scattering from the cottonwoods and made every living thing within a mile freeze in primal terror. Dust exploded from the mine shaft like cannon smoke, and then silence fell, heavy and absolute. Thomas dropped the bucket and ran toward the chaos before his mind could catch up with his body. He was 24 years old, a ranch hand who had been working cattle drives since he was 16, and he knew disaster when he heard it. Other men were already converging on the mine, their faces pale beneath layers of dirt and sweat. The foreman, a grizzled veteran named McCready, was shouting orders, but Thomas barely heard him. All he could focus on was the collapsed entrance, tons of rock and timber that had transformed the mine shaft into a tomb. "How many inside?" someone yelled. "3, maybe 4, McCready answered, his voice cracking. Cooper and his crew were setting charges in the new tunnel, and Miss Elwood, she went down to bring them lunch, not 10 minutes ago. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Penelope Elwood, he knew her, though not well. She was the daughter of the mine owner, a young woman of 22, who had returned to Ogden, Utah, just 3 months prior after finishing school back east. Unlike many women of means, she insisted on making herself useful, bringing meals to the miners and keeping the company books. Thomas had spoken to her only twice, brief exchanges about weather and horses, but he remembered her eyes, startlingly green against sun-bronzed skin, and the way she listened when people spoke, like their words actually mattered. "We need timber and rope," McCready was saying. "Get every able-bodied man. We dig careful like, shore up as we go, or we'll cause another collapse." Thomas moved forward, joining the line of men already starting to clear debris. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the rock face into a furnace. Within minutes, every man was drenched in sweat. They worked in a desperate rhythm, passing stones hand to hand, stopping every few minutes to call into the darkness and listen for response. Nothing came back but silence. An hour passed, then 2. The initial rush of volunteers began to thin as men returned to their duties, replaced by fresh workers. Thomas never left. His hands, calloused from years of rope work and hard labor, began to blister as he moved stone after stone. He barely noticed. Somewhere in that darkness, people were trapped, possibly injured, possibly dying. One of them was Penelope Elwood. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when they finally broke through to a pocket of air. McCready called for silence, then shouted into the gap, "Anyone alive in there? Call out!" At first, nothing. Then, faint as a ghost, a voice responded, "Here! We are here!" It was a woman's voice. Thomas felt something in his chest release, a tension he had not fully acknowledged. She was alive. "Miss Elwood?" McCready called. "Yes!" The voice was stronger now, charged with desperate hope. "Mr. Cooper is hurt badly. Davis and Morrison are dead. A beam fell. I cannot move it." The words hit the assembled men like physical blows. 2 dead, 1 badly injured, and Penelope trapped with the bodies and a dying man in the suffocating darkness. "We are coming," McCready promised. "Hold on, miss. Just hold on." But progress was agonizingly slow. The collapsed section was unstable, requiring careful shoring with timber before they could advance even a few feet. Night fell, and lanterns were brought out, casting wild shadows across the worksite. Men's faces became masks of exhaustion and determination. Thomas kept working, ignoring the pain in his hands, ignoring everything except the next stone, the next careful extraction. "You need rest," McCready said, gripping Thomas's shoulder. "You have been at this for 8 hours straight." "I am not stopping," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse from dust and exertion. McCready studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but drink some water at least. You are no good to anyone if you collapse." Thomas drank, barely tasting the liquid, then returned to his position. They had managed to widen the air pocket, and he could now call directly into it. "Miss Elwood, can you hear me?" "Yes." Her voice was clearer now, closer. "Who is that?" "Thomas Fairmont, miss. We are working as fast as we safely can." A pause. "I remember you. You have the paint horse, the one with the white blaze." He was surprised she recalled such a detail. "That is right. Cherokee, how are you holding up?" I am unharmed, but Mr. Cooper, he needs help soon. He keeps fading in and out. Thomas looked at the wall of rubble still separating them. In the lamplight, it seemed impossibly vast. Talk to him. Keep him awake. We will get to you. Through the night they worked. Other men came and went in shifts, but Thomas remained, driven by something he could not name. His hands began to bleed, the blisters bursting and weeping, mixing blood with dust until his palms were slick and dark. Someone offered him gloves, but they made his grip clumsy, so he discarded them. He could hear Penelope through the gap now, hear her talking to Cooper, her voice steady despite the horror of her situation. She was singing hymns, old songs he remembered from childhood Sundays. "You should rest," she called to him during one of the brief pauses. "I can hear you working. You have been there all night, haven't you?" "How did you know?" Thomas asked, using the moment to catch his breath. "Your voice. You are the only one who hasn't changed. Everyone else comes and goes, but you stay." Something in her words made his chest tighten. "I will be here until you are out." Dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene given the circumstances. Thomas's entire body screamed with fatigue. His hands were torn and bleeding, his back a solid column of pain. But they were close now. The gap had widened to nearly 2 feet across. McCready called for the smallest man on the crew. "We can send someone through," he said. "Get water and supplies to them, assess Cooper's condition." But before anyone could volunteer, there was a terrible grinding sound. The mountain groaned, and fresh dust poured from the opening. Men scattered as rocks tumbled down, some as large as a man's torso. When the dust cleared, the gap had collapsed again, now only 6 inches wide. Thomas heard Penelope cry out, a sound of pure despair that cut through him like a blade. Several men cursed. McCready looked ready to weep. "We start again," Thomas said, his voice rough but firm. "Now." "Fairmont, the whole thing is unstable," McCready protested. "We might need to try coming in from another angle, dig a whole new shaft. It could take days." "She does not have days. Cooper certainly does not." Thomas was already moving rocks again, his bleeding hands leaving crimson smears on the stone. "I am not waiting. Anyone who wants to help, I welcome it. Anyone who does not, get out of my way." For a moment, no one moved. Then one man stepped forward, then another. Within minutes, the full crew was back at work. Something had shifted. Thomas's stubborn refusal to give up had lit a fire in the others. They worked with renewed vigor, passing stones in silence, everyone focused on the singular goal of reaching the trapped woman and her dying companion. The morning wore on. The temperature climbed. Thomas stopped registering pain, stopped registering anything except the work. His hands moved automatically, gripping stone, lifting, passing, reaching for the next. Blood ran down his wrists. Someone tried to bandage his hands, but he shook them off impatiently. There was no time for bandages. "Thomas?" Penelope's voice came through the small opening. She sounded exhausted, frightened. "Mr. Cooper stopped breathing a few minutes ago. I tried to wake him, but he won't respond." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Another death. "I am sorry, Miss Elwood. I am so sorry." "Please," she whispered, and for the first time he heard tears in her voice. "Please get me out. I cannot bear this darkness anymore. I cannot be here with them. I cannot—" Her voice broke. Thomas leaned close to the gap. "Penelope, listen to me. I am going to get you out. I swear on everything I hold sacred, I am not leaving this spot until you are free. Do you understand me?" "Why?" The question was so soft he almost missed it. "You don't even know me." "That does not matter," Thomas said, surprised by his own certainty. "You are a person in trouble, and I can help. That is all the reason I need." But even as he said it, he knew it was not entirely true. There was something more, something he could not quite articulate. Perhaps it was the sound of her voice in the darkness, brave despite her terror. Perhaps it was the way she had stayed with Cooper, singing to him, refusing to let him die alone. Perhaps it was simply that in this moment, saving her had become the most important thing in his world. The crew worked through the afternoon. Men who had been on shift overnight went home to sleep and returned hours later. Fresh supplies arrived, food and water and more timber. Thomas accepted water when it was forced on him, but refused food, refused rest. His vision began to blur with exhaustion. His hands had gone numb, which was perhaps a mercy. He moved in a trance-like state, every action mechanical, driven by will alone. "Fairmont, you are going to kill yourself," McCready said, physically blocking his path. "Look at your hands, man. You can barely grip the stones anymore." "Then I will push them with my shoulders," Thomas replied. "Get out of my way." "Damn it, boy!" But McCready stepped aside. There was something in Thomas's eyes that even the grizzled foreman would not challenge. The sun was setting again, painting everything in blood-red light when they finally broke through. The gap widened suddenly as a keystone was removed, and Thomas found himself staring into a cavern perhaps 10 feet across. In the lamplight, he could see 3 bodies. 2 were clearly dead, crushed beneath a massive beam. The third, Cooper, lay motionless a few feet away. And there, pressed against the far wall, was Penelope Elwood. She was covered in dust, her dress torn and filthy, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. But when the lamplight fell across her, when she saw the opening and the men beyond it, her expression transformed. Hope, pure and radiant, bloomed across her features. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. "Oh, thank God." The gap was still too small for a man to pass through easily, but Thomas did not hesitate. He squeezed through the opening, ignoring the rocks that scraped his ribs and shoulders, and dropped down into the cavern. His legs nearly buckled when he landed, exhaustion finally catching up with him, but he forced himself to stay upright. Penelope stared at him as he approached. "You actually did it," she whispered. "You actually—" Then she was moving, crossing the space between them, and suddenly she was in his arms. She was shaking, her whole body trembling with shock and relief and delayed terror. Thomas held her carefully, aware of his bleeding hands, aware of how close she had come to death. "You are safe now," he murmured. "I have got you." She pulled back slightly to look at him, and in the lamplight, he could see her green eyes were swimming with tears. "Your hands," she said, horror crossing her face as she took in the damage. "Oh God, what have you done to yourself?" "Got you out," Thomas said simply. "That is what matters." Other men were squeezing through the opening now. They quickly assessed the situation, confirming what everyone already knew. Morrison, Davis, and Cooper were all dead. There was nothing to be done for them now. The priority was getting Penelope out safely. "Can you climb?" McCready asked her. "We will have to go back through the gap." She nodded, squaring her shoulders despite her obvious exhaustion. "I can do whatever you need me to do." They fashioned a rope harness around her waist, and Thomas climbed through the gap first, then turned to help guide her. She squeezed through the narrow opening with difficulty, her dress catching on rocks, but she did not complain. When she emerged on the other side, the men who had spent the last 30 hours digging let out a ragged cheer. "Let us get you to the surface," McCready said gently. "Your father has been beside himself." The journey out of the mine was slow. The tunnel was still unstable, timbers groaning ominously around them. But finally, after what felt like another eternity, they emerged into the evening air. A crowd had gathered outside, miners and townspeople who had been keeping vigil. When Penelope appeared, supported by Thomas on one side and McCready on the other, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. A well-dressed man pushed through the throng, tears streaming down his face. "Penelope, my girl!" "Father," Penelope said, and there was such relief in her voice. She pulled away from her supporters and went to him, and they embraced fiercely. Thomas stood swaying slightly, watching the reunion through a haze of exhaustion. Now that she was safe, now that the impossible task was complete, his body was beginning to shut down. His vision tunneled, his legs felt like water. "Easy there," McCready said, gripping his arm. "Someone get the doctor. Fairmont needs medical attention." "I am fine," Thomas protested, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "You are not fine, you stubborn fool. You just worked for 30 straight hours with minimal water and no food, and your hands look like you stuck them in a meat grinder." McCready was half supporting him now, guiding him toward a bench. "Sit down before you fall down." Thomas sat gratefully. Around him, people were talking, asking questions, praising the rescue effort. He heard Penelope telling her father what had happened, her voice catching when she described the deaths of the 3 men. He heard someone mention that Thomas had never left the mine entrance, had worked longer and harder than anyone. He felt embarrassed by the attention. Then Penelope was there, kneeling in front of him despite her father's protests. Her face was cleaned somewhat, though dust still clung to her hair and clothes. "Let me see," she said softly, reaching for his hands. Thomas tried to pull them back. "They are not fit for viewing, miss." "They are not fit for viewing because you destroyed them saving my life," she replied firmly. "Let me see." Reluctantly, he extended his hands. In the lamplight, the damage was shocking even to him. The palms were raw meat, blisters layered upon blisters, all burst and bleeding. His fingers were swollen, the nails cracked and torn. Blood had dried in dark streaks up his forearms. Penelope made a small sound of distress. "Oh, Thomas, you did this for me." "I would do it again," he said, and found he meant it absolutely. She looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Why? You don't know me. We have barely spoken." It was the same question she had asked through the rocks, and Thomas still did not have a good answer. How could he explain the compulsion that had driven him? The absolute certainty that he could not leave until she was safe? How could he explain that, somewhere in those 30 hours, her voice in the darkness had become the most important sound in his world? "Sometimes you just know something is important," he said finally. "Sometimes you just know you have to act." Before she could respond, the doctor arrived, an elderly man named Patterson, who immediately began clucking over Thomas's hands. "Good Lord, boy, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking someone needed help," Thomas replied. Dr. Patterson shook his head, but began cleaning the wounds with surprising gentleness. Thomas hissed in pain as the doctor poured water over his torn palms, washing away blood and grit. Penelope stayed beside him the entire time, one hand resting on his shoulder as though to steady him. "You are going to need to keep these bandaged and clean, doctor," Patterson said as he worked. "No manual labor for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. These hands have been through hell." "2 weeks?" Thomas protested. "I cannot afford to miss that much work." "You cannot afford not to," the doctor countered. "You risk permanent damage or infection if you don't let these heal properly." Penelope's father approached, his expression grave. "Mr. Fairmont, is it?" "Yes, sir. My daughter tells me you led the rescue effort, that you worked without rest to reach her." Robert Elwood's voice was thick with emotion. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." "No debt, sir. I only did what needed doing. Nevertheless, I insist on compensating you for your time and suffering, and I will ensure you are paid full wages for as long as you need to recover. It is the absolute least I can do." Thomas wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at him like a riptide. His eyes kept wanting to close. The doctor finished bandaging his hands, wrapping them in clean white cloth that immediately began to show spots of seeping blood. "He needs rest," Dr. Patterson announced. "Real rest, in a real bed. And someone should check on him regularly to change these bandages and watch for infection." "He can stay at our house," Penelope said immediately. Both Thomas and her father turned to stare at her. She met their gazes steadily. "We have the space, and it is the least we can do, given that he nearly killed himself to save my life. I can change his bandages and make sure he rests properly." "Penelope, that is not appropriate," her father began. "What is not appropriate is letting the man who saved my life go home to some boarding house room with no one to care for him," she replied, her voice firm. "He needs proper attention, father. You know it as well as I do." Robert Elwood looked between his daughter and Thomas, clearly torn. Finally, he sighed. "Very well, but propriety must be maintained. You will attend to him only when Mrs. Chen is present." Mrs. Chen was their housekeeper, a formidable Chinese woman who had been with the family for years. Penelope nodded agreement. "Of course. Miss Elwood, you do not need to do this," Thomas protested. "I will be fine." "You will be fine because I am going to make sure of it," she replied. "Now, can you stand? We need to get you cleaned up and into bed before you fall over." Thomas tried to stand and immediately swayed. McCready and another miner caught him, keeping him upright. Everything felt distant and strange, like he was experiencing the world through thick glass. "Bring him to the carriage," Robert Elwood directed. "Carefully now." The next period of time passed in fragments. Thomas was vaguely aware of being loaded into a carriage, of movement and voices, of being helped into a house far finer than anywhere he had ever been. He protested weakly that he was too dirty, that he would ruin the furniture, but no one paid him any mind. Someone helped him out of his filthy clothes and into a bath. The water turned rust red with blood and dirt. Gentle hands washed his hair and back, careful to avoid his bandaged palms. Then he was in a bed, a real bed with clean sheets and a soft pillow, and he simply could not fight anymore. Sleep crashed over him like a wave, pulling him under into deep, dreamless oblivion. When Thomas woke, sunlight was streaming through lace curtains. For a disoriented moment, he had no idea where he was. The room was too nice, the bed too comfortable. Then memory returned in a rush. The mine, the cave, in. Penelope. He sat up quickly, then groaned as his body protested. He was sore in places he had not known could be sore. His hands throbbed beneath their bandages, a deep ache that made him grit his teeth. But he was alive, and more importantly, Penelope was alive. A knock sounded at the door. "Mr. Fairmont, are you awake?" It was her voice. "Yes, miss," he called. The door opened, and Penelope entered with a tray of food, followed by an older Chinese woman who could only be Mrs. Chen. Penelope looked transformed from the previous night. She was clean, dressed in a simple blue day dress, her dark hair pinned up neatly. Only the shadows under her eyes betrayed what she had been through. "How do you feel?" she asked, setting the tray on a table beside the bed. "Like I fought a mountain and the mountain won," Thomas admitted. "How long did I sleep?" 14 hours. It is past noon now." She pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "Are you hungry?" Mrs. Chen made soup and fresh bread. Thomas's stomach growled loudly in response, making Penelope laugh. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and the sound made something warm unfurl in his chest. "I will take that as a yes," she said. "But first, let me check your bandages. Dr. Patterson was by earlier and left instructions." She unwrapped his hands carefully, her touch feather light. Thomas watched her face as she worked, noting the concentration in her expression, the way she bit her lower lip slightly. The wounds looked angry and raw in the daylight, but the bleeding had stopped. "The doctor says they are healing as well as can be expected," Penelope reported. "No signs of infection yet, thank God. But we need to keep them clean and bandaged." She began applying a salve that smelled of herbs and something medicinal, then rewrapped his hands in fresh bandages. Her movements were competent and sure, and Thomas realized she must have done this before. "Did you help nurse during the war?" he asked. She nodded. "I was young, but yes, my mother ran a hospital in our home for wounded soldiers passing through. I learned a lot about caring for injuries." A shadow crossed her face. "She died of fever in 1867, caught from one of the patients." "I am sorry," Thomas said softly. She would have said it was worth it, helping those men. Penelope finished tying off the bandage. "There. Now, let us get some food into you." She tried to help him eat, but Thomas stubbornly insisted on managing himself, despite the awkwardness of his bandaged hands. The soup was rich and flavorful, the bread soft and warm. He had not realized how hungry he was until he started eating. Penelope watched him with amusement and approval. "Dr. Patterson says you are to rest for at least 2 weeks," she informed him. "No work, no heavy lifting, nothing that will strain those hands." 2 weeks, Thomas repeated. "I cannot impose on your hospitality for 2 weeks." "You can and you will," Penelope replied firmly. "Besides, I owe you my life. 2 weeks of room and board is hardly adequate repayment." "You do not owe me anything." "I owe you everything," she countered. Her voice softened. "Thomas, I was trapped in that darkness for almost 36 hours. I was surrounded by dead men, breathing stale air, not knowing if anyone would reach me in time. And through it all, I could hear you working. I could hear your voice telling me to hold on. You never stopped. You never gave up. Do you have any idea what that meant to me?" Thomas felt heat creeping up his neck. "I only did what anyone would do." "That is not true, and you know it. Plenty of men stopped to rest, to eat, to sleep. You did not. You worked until your hands were bleeding and you could barely stand." She leaned forward, her green eyes intense. "Why, Thomas? Please tell me why." He struggled to find words for something he barely understood himself. "When I heard you were trapped down there, something in me I could not accept it. Could not accept the possibility that you would not make it out. I do not know why. I wish I had a better explanation." "Maybe there is no explanation," Penelope said quietly. "Maybe some things just are." They sat in silence for a moment, something unspoken hanging in the air between them. Mrs. Chen, who had been standing quietly by the door, cleared her throat. "Miss Penelope, your father wishes to speak with you." Penelope stood reluctantly. "I will check on you later. Rest, please. Your body has been through tremendous strain." After she left, Thomas lay back against the pillows, his mind spinning. What was he doing here, in this fine house being tended to by a woman so far above his station? Penelope Elwood was the mine owner's daughter, educated back east, refined and cultured. He was a ranch hand, a drifter who moved from job to job, owning nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back. The gulf between them was enormous, and yet, when she looked at him, he felt like maybe that gulf did not matter. Maybe for once in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The days that followed fell into a strange but pleasant routine. Penelope visited him several times a day, checking his bandages, bringing him meals, sitting and talking with him for hours. She told him about her time back east, about the schools she had attended and the cities she had seen. She described art galleries and museums, theaters and concerts, a world so different from the rough mining town of Ogden that it might as well have been a different country. In turn, Thomas told her about his life on cattle drives, about sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, about rivers crossed and storms endured. He told her about his family's small farm in Kansas and how drought and debt had forced them to sell when he was 15. His parents had died of cholera the following year, leaving him alone at 16 to make his way in the world. "That must have been terribly hard," Penelope said, her eyes filled with sympathy. "It taught me to be self-reliant," Thomas replied, "and it taught me that home is not a place. It is wherever you make it." "Have you made a home anywhere since then?" Thomas considered the question. "Not really. I suppose I have been searching without knowing what I was searching for." As the days passed, Thomas's hands began to heal. The angry redness faded, replaced by new pink skin. The pain diminished to a dull ache. He started walking around the house, then the garden, regaining his strength. Robert Elwood was often away at the mine, dealing with the aftermath of the cave-in and arranging for the burial of the 3 men who had died. But when he was home, he treated Thomas with respect and gratitude, asking about his recovery and his plans once he healed. The truth was, Thomas had no plans. Before the accident, he had been considering moving on, maybe heading to Colorado or Montana for ranch work. But now, the thought of leaving Ogden filled him with unexpected reluctance. He tried to tell himself it was just because he was comfortable here, because his hands were not yet fully healed, but he knew it was more than that. It was Penelope. Everything came back to Penelope. He found himself watching for her throughout the day, listening for her footsteps, anticipating her visits. When she smiled at him, he felt like he could take on the world. When she laughed at something he said, it was better than any whiskey he had ever tasted. He was falling for her, had been falling since he pulled her from that dark cavern, and the realization both thrilled and terrified him. Because what could he possibly offer someone like her? He had no money, no property, no prospects beyond occasional ranch work. She deserved someone established, someone who could give her the life she was accustomed to. He was just a cowboy who had happened to be in the right place at the right time. One afternoon, about 10 days after the rescue, Penelope found him in the garden, absently flexing his healing hands. The bandages were smaller now, covering only his palms. "They are looking better," she observed, sitting beside him on the bench. "Almost good as new," Thomas agreed. "Another few days and I should be able to work again." "Are you so eager to leave us?" There was something in her voice, a note of vulnerability that made him look at her sharply. "It is not eagerness to leave," he said carefully. "It is just, I have imposed on your family's generosity long enough. I need to earn my keep. My father has already paid you for the work you missed, and I know he wants to offer you a position at the mine, something supervisory, better than ranch work." Thomas shook his head. "That is kind, but I am not a mining man. I belong on horseback, under open sky." "Is there nothing that would make you want to stay in Ogden?" Penelope asked, and now she was looking directly at him, her green eyes searching his face. Thomas's breath caught. Was she asking what he thought she was asking? "Miss Elwood. Penelope," she corrected. "After everything, I think you have earned the right to call me by my given name." "Penelope," he repeated, loving the feel of her name in his mouth. "I am not sure what you are asking me." She took a breath, as though steeling herself. These past 10 days, I have spent more time with you than with anyone else in my life. I have told you things I have never told anyone, and I have come to realize something." She paused, then continued in a rush. "I have feelings for you, Thomas, real feelings. And I hope, you might feel the same way about me." Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest. She had just spoken aloud the very thing he had been afraid to acknowledge. "Penelope, I am a ranch hand. I have nothing to offer you. Your father would never approve of me courting you." "My father approves of the man who saved his daughter's life," Penelope replied. "He may need some convincing about the courting part, but I think he will come around. The question is not whether he approves. The question is whether you want this, whether you want me." "Want you?" Thomas repeated incredulously. "I have thought of little else for days, but wanting and having are two different things." "Why should they be?" Penelope challenged. "Thomas, I have spent my whole life doing what was expected of me, being the proper young lady, going to the right schools, learning the right things. And then I nearly died in that mine. I spent hours in the darkness thinking I would never see daylight again, never have the chance to live the life I wanted instead of the life others wanted for me. When you pulled me out, you gave me a second chance, and I am not going to waste it by being too afraid to reach for what I want." She took his bandaged hands in hers, careful of his healing palms. "I want you, Thomas Fairmont. I want to see where this goes between us. If you want the same thing, then we will figure out the rest together." Thomas looked down at their joined hands, at her slender fingers wrapped around his battered ones. He thought about all the reasons this was a bad idea, all the ways it could go wrong. Then he thought about her voice in the darkness, guiding him through those desperate hours. He thought about how she made him laugh, how she listened when he spoke, how she looked at him like he mattered. Sometimes you just had to take a leap and trust the landing would be there. "I want that too," he said quietly. "More than anything." The smile that broke across Penelope's face was radiant. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative. Thomas forgot about his injured hands, forgot about propriety, forgot about everything except the sweetness of her lips and the rightness of this moment. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Well," Penelope said, slightly dazed. "That was worth waiting for," Thomas finished. She laughed, the sound pure joy. "Come on. We should tell Father before rumors start. You know how quickly gossip spreads in a town like this." Robert Elwood's initial reaction was about what Thomas expected. He sputtered, turned red, and looked ready to throw Thomas out of the house. But Penelope stood her ground, making her case with the same fierce determination she had shown in the mine. She reminded her father that Thomas had saved her life, that he was a good and honorable man, that she was 22 years old and perfectly capable of choosing her own romantic interests. "You have known him less than 2 weeks," Robert protested. "I have known him through circumstances that revealed his true character," Penelope countered. "That is worth more than years of superficial acquaintance." In the end, Robert gave his reluctant blessing, though with conditions. Thomas would need to establish himself properly, secure steady employment, and prove he could provide for a wife. The courtship would be properly chaperoned, and if at any point Robert felt Thomas was not treating his daughter well, the arrangement would end immediately. "Fair enough," Thomas agreed. He would have agreed to almost anything in that moment. "You understand I am placing enormous trust in you," Robert said seriously. "My daughter is everything to me. If you hurt her—" "I would rather cut off my own hands than hurt her," Thomas replied. "And given what I just put them through, I think you can trust I mean that literally." Despite himself, Robert cracked a smile. "Very well. Now, about employment. I know you said you are not a mining man, but I have other interests. I own a considerable amount of ranch land east of town. The current foreman is looking to retire. The position pays well and comes with a house. Would that suit you better?" Thomas felt a surge of hope. "That would suit me very well, sir. Thank you." Over the following weeks, Thomas threw himself into his new position. The ranch was substantial, running several hundred head of cattle and a breeding program for horses. The work was hard but familiar, and Thomas took to it naturally. The men respected him, especially once word spread about the mine rescue. He was fair but firm, demanding excellence but never asking anything he would not do himself. His hands healed completely, though they bore scars he would carry for the rest of his life. Penelope traced those scars sometimes when they sat together in the evening, her touch feather light, her expression tender. "Does it hurt?" she would ask. "Not anymore," he would reply. "They are just reminders." Of what? Of the day my life changed, of the day I found what I had been searching for. Their courtship proceeded under the watchful eyes of the community. They attended church together on Sundays, took chaperoned walks through town, had dinner at the Elwood house several times a week. Thomas met Penelope's friends, enduring their curious looks and probing questions with good humor. Penelope visited the ranch, learning to ride better and taking interest in the operation. She was full of surprises. Thomas had expected her to be delicate, perhaps squeamish around the rougher aspects of ranch work. Instead, she pitched in wherever she could, helping birth a difficult foal, caring for an injured calf, even learning to rope with surprising aptitude. "You are not what I expected," Thomas admitted one day as they rode the fence line together. "What did you expect?" Penelope asked, amused. "I do not know. Someone more refined, I suppose. Less comfortable with dirt and hard work." "I grew up in a mining town," Penelope reminded him. "I may have had schooling back east, but this is my home. This is real life. I never wanted to be some fragile thing kept in a parlor." "Good," Thomas said, "because I'm not sure I would know what to do with a fragile parlor thing." "You would be terrible at it," Penelope agreed cheerfully. "You would probably try to teach her to rope cattle or something equally inappropriate." "I am teaching you to rope cattle." "Exactly, which is why we are perfect for each other." The seasons changed. Summer faded into autumn, painting the mountains in gold and crimson. Thomas settled into his role as foreman, improving systems and building trust with the ranch hands. He moved into the foreman's house, a modest but comfortable two-bedroom structure with a porch that looked out over the rangeland. It was the first place that felt like home since his parents' farm. In November, 6 months after the mine collapse, Thomas asked Robert Elwood for permission to marry his daughter. They were in Robert's study, and Thomas was more nervous than he had ever been in his life. "I know I am not what you dreamed of for Penelope," he began. "I am not wealthy or well-connected, but I love your daughter with everything I am. I will spend every day of my life working to make her happy and give her the life she deserves." Robert studied him for a long moment. "You know, when Penelope first came home from school, I had plans. There were several young men from good families, sons of business partners, men who could have expanded our interests and secured Penelope's future. I was quite put out when she showed no interest in any of them." Thomas waited, not sure where this was going. "But then I saw her after the mine collapse," Robert continued. "I saw her look at you like you hung the moon and stars. I saw her come alive in a way she never had with those other young men. And I realized that all my careful planning meant nothing if she was not happy." He stood and extended his hand. "You have my blessing, Thomas. Welcome to the family." They shook hands, and Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Now he just had to ask Penelope. He planned it for a Sunday afternoon. They rode out to a spot he had discovered on the ranch, a high meadow that overlooked the valley. The late autumn sun cast everything in golden light. They dismounted and stood looking out over the vista, and Thomas tried to calm his racing heart. "Penelope," he began, then had to stop and clear his throat. "These past months with you have been the best of my life. You challenge me, inspire me, make me want to be better than I am. When I think about my future, I cannot imagine it without you in it." He pulled out the ring he had bought in town, a simple gold band with a small emerald that matched her eyes. Getting down on one knee, he looked up at her. "Will you marry me?" Penelope's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, absolutely yes." She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, and Thomas felt like he could fly. When they finally broke apart, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "How did you know my size?" Penelope asked, admiring the ring. "I may have enlisted Mrs. Chen's help," Thomas admitted. "She measured one of your other rings." "Sneaky," Penelope said approvingly. "I like it." They were married in January of 1879, 6 months after the cave-in Ogden's largest church. It seemed like the whole town turned out for the wedding. The miners from Silver Ridge were there, many of whom had helped with the rescue. Thomas's ranch hands attended, scrubbed clean and wearing their Sunday best. Penelope's friends from school had traveled from back east. Even the territorial governor sent congratulations. Penelope wore a dress of ivory silk. her dark hair crowned with flowers. Thomas wore a new suit that felt stiff and uncomfortable, but the look on Penelope's face when she saw him made it worthwhile. They exchanged vows in front of the packed church, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life brought. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Thomas kissed his bride, applause erupted through the church. It was not the most decorous of reactions, but it felt right. Their love story had been born in tragedy and desperation, witnessed by many in the room. The applause was celebration not just of a marriage, but of survival and second chances. The reception was held at the Elwood house, transformed for the occasion with flowers and decorations. There was music and dancing, food and drink, toasts and laughter. Thomas danced with his wife, marveling at how natural it felt to call her that, how right it was to hold her in his arms and know she was his forever. "Happy?" Penelope asked as they swayed together. "More than I knew was possible," Thomas replied honestly. "Good, because I have news." She smiled up at him, a secret in her eyes. "We are going to have a baby." Thomas stopped dancing, nearly causing a collision with the couple behind them. "What? When? How long have you known?" Penelope laughed at his shock. "I suspected for a few weeks, but wanted to be sure before I said anything. Dr. Patterson confirmed it yesterday. The baby should arrive in August." Thomas picked her up and spun her around, propriety forgotten. When he set her down, he was grinning like a fool. "We are going to be parents." "We are," Penelope confirmed. "Are you ready for that?" "I am ready for anything as long as I have you," Thomas said. They moved into the foreman's house, which suddenly felt much smaller with 2 people living in it. Penelope threw herself into making it a home, hanging curtains and arranging furniture, planting a garden in the small yard. Thomas added a rocking chair to the porch where Penelope could sit and look out over the land. As her pregnancy progressed, Thomas became increasingly protective. He worried when she lifted anything heavy, fussed when she rode horses, insisted she rest more than she wanted to. Penelope tolerated his concern with good humor, though she occasionally had to remind him she was pregnant, not made of glass. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she pointed out. "I am perfectly capable of normal activities." "I know," Thomas said, "but you are my wife carrying my child. Forgive me for being cautious." She softened at that. "I know you worry, and I love you for it. But you have to trust that I know my limits." "I trust you," Thomas assured her. "It is the rest of the universe I am not so sure about." In August, on a hot afternoon when the sky was cloudless and blue, Penelope went into labor. Thomas sent for Dr. Patterson and Mrs. Chen, then paced the front room like a caged animal while the women tended to his wife. Every cry from the bedroom made him flinch. He had faced down stampeding cattle, dangerous outlaws, and collapsing mines with courage. But this was different. This was Penelope in pain, and there was nothing he could do to help. Finally, after hours that felt like years, a new sound emerged, a baby's cry, strong and indignant. Thomas froze, his heart in his throat. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Thomas, a healthy boy." Thomas followed her into the bedroom in a daze. Penelope lay propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Thomas approached slowly, afraid he might break something, and looked down at his son. The baby had a scrunched red face and a surprising amount of dark hair. His tiny fists waved in the air, and his eyes were squeezed shut. He was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever seen. "Would you like to hold him?" Penelope asked softly. "I am not sure I know how," Thomas admitted. "You saved me from a collapsed mine. I think you can manage holding a baby." She guided his arms into position and carefully transferred their son. The baby settled against Thomas's chest, his crying quieting to little snuffles. Thomas looked down at this tiny person, so fragile and perfect, and felt something shift in his chest. This was his son, his and Penelope's, a whole new life that had not existed before, depending entirely on them. "Hello there," he whispered. "Welcome to the world." "What should we name him?" Penelope asked. They had discussed names for months, but never quite settled on one. Now, holding his son, Thomas thought of all the people who had shaped his life. His father, who had taught him the value of hard work. The ranch hands who had taken in a 16-year-old orphan and taught him their trade. Robert Elwood, who had given him a chance and a place to belong. "What about Robert Thomas Fairmont?" he suggested. "After your father, and maybe me." Penelope smiled. "Robert Thomas Fairmont. That sounds perfect." Young Robert, as they came to call him, proved to be a demanding but delightful addition to their lives. Thomas took to fatherhood with the same determination he brought to everything else, learning to change diapers and warm bottles, walking the floor with a crying baby in the middle of the night. He built a cradle with his scarred hands, each nail driven with care and love. Watching Thomas with their son, Penelope felt her heart swell with love. This strong, capable man, who could break a wild horse and work from dawn to dusk without complaint, was so gentle with their baby. He would sing to Robert in a soft voice, old trail songs and hymns, rocking him until he fell asleep. "You are a natural at this," she told him one evening, watching him settle the baby down for the night. "I do not know about that," Thomas replied. "I am making it up as I go." "We all are," Penelope said. "That is what parenting is, making it up and hoping you get it right more often than you get it wrong." The seasons turned. Robert grew from an infant to a toddler, taking his first steps and saying his first words. The ranch prospered under Thomas's management, and Robert Elwood began talking about expanding operations. Thomas and Penelope's life fell into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting, each day bringing new challenges and small joys. On the one-year anniversary of the mine collapse, Thomas and Penelope rode out to Silver Ridge. The mine had been closed permanently after the accident, deemed too unstable to continue operations safely. Robert Elwood had opened a new mine 5 miles away, with stricter safety protocols. But the old mine remained, a silent monument to what had happened there. They stood at the entrance, looking at the sealed tunnel. Wildflowers had grown up around the timbers, softening the scarred earth. It looked peaceful now, bearing little resemblance to the scene of desperation and tragedy Thomas remembered. "Do you ever think about that night?" Penelope asked quietly. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "I dream about it occasionally, but they are not bad dreams. Mostly I remember your voice and knowing I had to reach you." "I used to have nightmares," Penelope confessed, "about being trapped, about the darkness, but they have faded. Now, when I think about that time, I mostly remember that you came for me, that you never gave up." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. His palms still bore the scars from those desperate hours, white lines across his calloused skin. She traced them gently, as she often did. "These scars," she said, "they tell a story of courage and determination and love. I know you did not realize it was love at the time, but it was. You do not destroy your hands for a stranger. You do not work 30 straight hours for someone who means nothing to you." "Maybe I saw the future," Thomas suggested. "Maybe somehow I knew that you were my future, even then." "Maybe," Penelope agreed. "Or maybe love does not always announce itself clearly. Maybe sometimes it arrives in crisis and urgency, and you only recognize it later." They stood in silence for a moment, both thinking about the path that had brought them here. 3 men had died in that mine. It was tragedy and loss that should not be forgotten. But from that darkness had come light, had come their love and their life together. "We should plant something here," Penelope said suddenly. "A tree, maybe. Something living to remember what happened and honor those who died." "That is a good idea," Thomas agreed. They returned the following week with a young cottonwood sapling and a shovel. Together they planted it near the mine entrance, patting soil around its roots, watering it from canteens they had brought. It was a small thing, one tree in the vast Utah landscape, but it felt important. A symbol of life continuing, of hope and remembrance intertwined. As young Robert grew, they told him the story of how his parents met. Age-appropriate versions at first, leaving out the grimmest details. But as he got older, they shared more, helping him understand that his very existence was connected to those desperate hours in the mine. "You mean you would not have gotten married if Mama had not been trapped?" Robert asked when he was 7, trying to puzzle through the causality. "We might have eventually," Penelope said, "but we might have missed each other too. Sometimes the path to happiness is not straight or easy." "Your father worked very hard to save me," she continued. "He hurt himself doing it. But because he did, we found each other, and eventually, we found you." Robert studied his father's scarred hands with new understanding. "So these scars are why I am here?" "In a way," Thomas agreed. "These scars represent a choice I made, to not give up no matter what, and that choice led to everything good in my life. Then I am glad you hurt your hands, Robert said seriously, even if it hurt at the time. Thomas laughed and ruffled his son's hair. Me too, son, me too. 2 years later, Penelope became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and when labor came, it was shorter. Their daughter arrived on a spring morning, tiny and perfect with her mother's green eyes. They named her Sarah, after Thomas's mother, and she completed their family in ways they had not known were incomplete. Robert was a devoted big brother, always wanting to help with his baby sister. Thomas watched his children together and felt grateful beyond words. He had gone from being alone in the world to having a family, a home, a purpose, all because of one desperate day and one incredible woman. The years passed in the way they do when life is full and good. The children grew. The ranch prospered. Thomas took on more responsibility as Robert Elwood gradually retired, eventually managing not just the ranch, but several of the family's business interests. He proved to have a good head for such things, surprising himself as much as anyone. Penelope remained his partner in everything. She managed the household accounts, entertained business associates, and still found time to work in her garden and help with branding season. She was beloved in Ogden, known for her charity work and her refusal to put on airs despite her family's wealth. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised her with a trip to Denver. It was the farthest they had been from home since their honeymoon, and Penelope was delighted. They attended the theater, visited art galleries, dined in fancy restaurants. But on their last evening, as they walked through the city streets, Penelope squeezed his hand. "This has been wonderful," she said, "but I miss home. I miss our children and our house and our life." "Me too," Thomas admitted. "I thought I would love seeing the city, but mostly I just want to get back to the ranch." "We have built something good, have we not?" Penelope said, more statement than question. "The best," Thomas agreed. "The absolute best." When they returned home, the children rushed out to meet them, both talking over each other about everything that had happened while they were gone. Thomas scooped up Sarah while Robert attached himself to Penelope's skirts, and they all went inside together, a unit complete and whole. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Penelope sat on their porch as they often did. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air cool and clear. Thomas held Penelope's hand, his scarred palm against her smooth skin, and thought about the journey that had brought them here. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Marrying me instead of one of those well-connected men your father wanted for you?" Penelope turned to him, her expression serious. "Thomas Fairmont, you dug through a mountain with your bare hands to save me. You worked until you bled and kept working. You gave up sleep and food and your own well-being because you refused to let me die. Why would I ever regret choosing you?" "I just want to make sure you are happy," Thomas said, "that you do not feel like you settled." "Settled?" Penelope laughed. "Thomas, I married a man who showed me what true courage and determination look like. A man who treats me as an equal partner, who makes me laugh, who is an incredible father to our children. If anything, you were the one who settled. You could have married someone without the baggage of a mind collapse and near-death experience." "That baggage led me to you," Thomas pointed out. "I would not change a moment of it." "Nor would I," Penelope said. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. The years continued their steady march. Robert grew into a serious young man, who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Sarah proved to be spirited and intelligent, with her mother's determination and her father's work ethic. The family faced challenges, as all families do, drought years and harsh winters, sickness and disappointments. But they faced them together, and that made all the difference. When Thomas was 45, Robert Elwood passed away quietly in his sleep. It was a peaceful end to a good life, but Thomas mourned deeply. His father-in-law had given him a chance when he had nothing, had trusted him with responsibility, and eventually with his daughter. At the funeral, Thomas spoke about Robert's generosity and vision, about how he had built not just businesses, but community. "He was a good man," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I will spend the rest of my life trying to live up to the faith he placed in me." Penelope inherited her father's estate, making them quite wealthy by most standards. But little changed in their daily lives. They still lived in the same house, though they expanded it over the years. Thomas still worked the ranch, though he hired more hands and spent more time on management. Penelope still kept her garden and her charity work. Wealth was a tool, they believed, not an identity. Young Robert married at 23, bringing home a lovely young woman named Catherine who fit perfectly into the family. Sarah followed a few years later, marrying a lawyer from Salt Lake City despite her father's initial reservations about city folk. "He is a good man," Sarah insisted. "He treats me well and makes me happy. Isn't that what matters?" Thomas had to concede the point. And indeed, Sarah's husband proved himself steady and devoted, eventually moving his practice to Ogden to be closer to family. Grandchildren arrived, first one, then another, until Thomas and Penelope's house was often filled with the sounds of young voices and running feet. Thomas built a swing in the big cottonwood in the yard and spent countless hours pushing grandchildren, listening to their laughter ring out across the property. "You are a soft touch," Penelope teased, watching him with their youngest grandchild, a girl of 4 named Emma. "I am merely ensuring the next generation appreciates simple pleasures," Thomas replied with dignity, then ruined it by making a silly face that sent Emma into giggles. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. The house was packed with children, grandchildren, friends, and extended family. There was music and dancing, stories and laughter. At one point, someone asked Thomas to tell the story of how he and Penelope met. He had told this story many times over the years, but he never tired of it. He spoke about the mine collapse, about the desperate hours of digging, about hearing Penelope's voice in the darkness. He talked about how he had worked until his hands bled, driven by a compulsion he had not fully understood at the time. "But I understand it now," he said, looking at Penelope across the room. "I was working to save my future. Everything good in my life started in that moment. My wife, my children, my grandchildren, this life we have built. All of it traces back to one choice: to not give up, to keep digging, to believe that the effort mattered." He held up his hands, the scars still visible after all these years. "These marks remind me every day that the best things in life are worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth sacrificing for." Penelope came to stand beside him, taking his scarred hands in hers. "And I am reminded every day that I married a man who knows what really matters, not wealth or status or comfort, but love and determination and the willingness to do whatever it takes for the people you care about." Their children and grandchildren applauded, and someone called for a toast. Glasses were raised, wishes spoken, but Thomas barely heard them. He was looking at Penelope, seeing not just the woman she was now, with silver threading through her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes, but all the versions of her he had known. The frightened woman trapped in a mine, the brave woman who had chosen him despite their differences, the partner who had built a life with him, the mother of his children, his best friend. "I love you," he said quietly, just for her. "I love you too," she replied. "Always have, always will." The party continued around them, but for a moment, they stood in their own world, hands clasped, hearts intertwined. It had been 25 years since that August day when Thomas had dug through rock and earth with bleeding hands. 25 years since Penelope had emerged from darkness into light. 25 years of marriage, of partnership, of love. And they were not done yet. There were still years ahead, more memories to make, more grandchildren to spoil, more sunsets to watch from their porch. The story that had started in a collapsed mine continued, chapter after chapter, each one better than the last. As evening fell and guests began to depart, Thomas and Penelope found themselves back on their familiar porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. It was where they had spent countless evenings over the years, talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence. 25 years, Penelope mused. It has gone so fast. And so slow, Thomas added. I feel like I have known you forever, but also like we just met yesterday. Do you remember what you said to me through the rocks when I asked why you were helping? Thomas thought back. I said sometimes you just know something is important. Sometimes you just know you have to act. You were right, Penelope said. Sometimes life puts a choice in front of you, and you just know what you have to do. You knew you had to dig. I knew I had to choose you, despite all the logical reasons not to. Our children know they need to follow their hearts. It is a good lesson. I got lucky, Thomas said. My instinct led me to you. Not luck, Penelope corrected. Character. You are the kind of man who digs until his hands bleed to save someone. That is not luck. That is who you are. And that is why I love you. They sat in silence for a while, hands linked, watching the stars. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, cattle lowing softly, horses moving in their corrals, the wind in the cottonwoods. It was the soundtrack of their life, familiar and beloved. Thank you, Thomas said suddenly. For what? For choosing me, for believing in us, for building this life with me. He gestured to encompass the house, the ranch, everything they had created together. I was just a drifter with nothing to my name. You made me into so much more. We made each other into more, Penelope said. That is what love does. It does not diminish or limit. It expands and elevates. You made me braver, Thomas. You taught me that proper and expected are not the same as happy. You showed me what it means to commit fully to something, to not give up when things get hard. I learned that from you, Thomas protested. You were trapped in a collapsing mine with dead men, and you kept your head. You stayed calm. You survived. Because I could hear you working, Penelope said. Because I knew you had not given up on me. We saved each other that day, Thomas. In different ways, but equally important. More years passed, each one adding to the tapestry of their shared life. They watched their grandchildren grow, attended school programs and graduations, celebrated weddings. The ranch continued to thrive, now being run primarily by their son Robert, with Thomas serving in an advisory role. Thomas and Penelope took the opportunity to travel more, visiting their daughter in Salt Lake City, making a trip to San Francisco, even venturing back east to see the cities Penelope had known in her youth. But they always came home to Ogden, to their house and their land, to the place where their love had been forged in darkness and desperation. The cottonwood they had planted at the old mine had grown tall and strong, visible from the road. Sometimes they would ride out there, sitting in the shade of that tree, remembering. When Thomas turned 60, Penelope organized a surprise party that brought people from all over, former ranch hands who had worked under his leadership, business associates, friends from church, the territorial governor, who had become a personal friend over the years. But the best surprise was 3 men who had helped dig during the mine rescue, miners who had long since moved on to other pursuits but who remembered those desperate hours. We wanted to come back and see how things turned out, one of them said. We all wondered, whether it would last, whether the mine owner's daughter and the determined cowboy would make it work. Looks like you did more than make it work, another added, looking around at the prosperous ranch and large family. Looks like you built something remarkable. Thomas shook hands with each of them, remembering their faces from that terrible night, remembering how they had worked together in shared purpose. Thank you for being there, he said. Thank you for helping me reach her. We just moved rocks, the third man said. You were the one who would not quit. We all took breaks, remember? We all went home to rest, but you stayed. That was all you, friend. Later, when the party had wound down and most guests had departed, Thomas found Penelope in the garden. She was deadheading roses, something she had done countless times over the years. The evening light gilded her silver hair, and Thomas was struck by how beautiful she still was to him. There you are, she said, smiling up at him. Did you enjoy your party? It was perfect, Thomas replied, though I suspect you had a hand in organizing it. I might have contributed, Penelope admitted. You deserve to be celebrated, Thomas. You have lived a good life, been a good man. People remember that. Thomas pulled her close, careful of the roses she was still holding. The only thing that matters is what you think. Am I the man you hoped I would be when you chose me? You are so much more, Penelope said softly. You exceeded every hope, every dream. I won the day I was trapped in that mine, Thomas. I won because it brought me you. I think we both won, Thomas said. They walked back to the house together, Thomas's arm around Penelope's shoulders, her head resting against him. It was a posture they had assumed thousands of times over the decades, comfortable and natural. They belonged together, had always belonged together, from the moment Thomas heard her scream and started digging. The years continued to pass, gentle now, each one a gift. Thomas and Penelope grew old together, their hair silver, their movements slower, but their love undimmed. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The family had grown large and sprawling, but Thomas could name every member, knew every birthday, took interest in every life. "You are the patriarch now," Penelope told him, watching him with a great-grandchild on his knee. "The foundation on which this whole family rests." "We are the foundation," Thomas corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you." They talked often about the past, remembering their early days with fondness, the struggles of making ends meet when Thomas was just starting as foreman, the joy of their children's births, the proud moments and the difficult ones. It had not all been easy, but it had all been worthwhile. One evening, when Thomas was 72, they sat on their porch watching the sunset. It was autumn, the air crisp and cool, the mountains ablaze with color. Penelope's hand was in his, their fingers intertwined as they had been for nearly 5 decades. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked. It was a question he had asked before, but he asked it again now, wanting to know after all these years. "Regret choosing you? Regret this life?" Penelope shook her head. "Never, not for a single moment. You gave me everything, Thomas. Love, partnership, family, purpose. What could I possibly regret?" "I just want to make sure," Thomas said. "I want to know that I made you happy." "You made me happier than I ever imagined possible," Penelope replied. She squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar scars on his palm. "These hands dug me out of darkness. These hands built our home. These hands have held our children and grandchildren. These hands have held my heart for 45 years. How could I be anything but grateful?" Thomas brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I love you, Penelope Fairmont. I loved you when I was digging through that mountain, though I did not know it yet. I love you now. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Penelope said. "Always." They sat together as darkness fell, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a beautiful life. The stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched over them for decades. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the ranch, the life they had created together still going strong. It was a good life, a life worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth every sacrifice. A life that had started with a scream in the darkness and a cowboy who refused to give up. A life built on love and determination, on second chances and brave choices. It was their life, and it was perfect. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at 78. Penelope beside him, as she had been for 51 years. The funeral was huge, attended by what seemed like half of Utah. People spoke of his integrity, his work ethic, his kindness. But mostly they spoke of his love for Penelope, a love that had become legendary in the region. Penelope stood at his grave with her children and grandchildren around her, and though she wept, there was peace in her tears. They had been given so much time, so many years together. They had built something that would endure long after they were both gone. She lived another 6 years, spending her time with family, keeping Thomas's memory alive through stories. She told the grandchildren about the mine collapse, about their grandfather's determination, about how love sometimes arrives in crisis and darkness, but becomes light. When her own time came, she was ready. Her last words were about Thomas, about how she was going to see him again, about how their story was not ending, but continuing in a different form. They buried her beside him, and on the shared headstone, the family inscribed words that Penelope had chosen. Thomas Fairmont, who dug until his hands bled to save the woman he loved. Penelope Fairmont, who was worth every sacrifice. Together, they built a love that will never die. Below that, their dates. Thomas, 1854, 1932. Penelope, 1856, 1938. The ranch continued under their son's care, then his son's, remaining in the family for generations. The house where Thomas and Penelope had lived, where they had raised their children and grown old together, was maintained and cherished. And every year, on the anniversary of the mine collapse, the family would gather at the old Silver Ridge mine, where the cottonwood tree grew tall and strong. They would tell the story again, making sure each new generation knew where they came from. They would talk about courage and determination, about love that transcends logic and circumstance. They would remember Thomas and Penelope, the cowboy and the mine owner's daughter, whose love had started in darkness but had blazed bright for over half a century. And in the telling and retelling, Thomas and Penelope lived on, their love story inspiring new generations to believe in second chances, to fight for what matters, to never give up when the stakes are high. It was a legacy as enduring as the mountains themselves, a testament to what two people can build when they choose each other against all odds. The story that began with a scream in a cave-in, that was forged in desperation and blood and 30 hours of relentless digging, had become something greater than either of them could have imagined. It had become family, community, lasting impact. It had become proof that sometimes the best love stories start in the darkest places, and that true love, once found, never truly ends. Thomas had dug until his hands bled to pull Penelope from that collapsed mine. But in doing so, he had also pulled himself from a life of drifting aimlessness into one of purpose and joy. They had saved each other that day, in every way that mattered. And in the years that followed, they had built a life that honored that salvation, that celebrated every hard-won moment, that proved beyond doubt that some things are worth fighting for with everything you have. Their great-grandchildren would grow up hearing the story, would trace the scars on photos of Thomas's hands, would visit the grave where two people who loved each other rested side by side, and they would understand, even if they could not fully articulate it, that they were the product of a love that refused to give up, that fought through rock and earth and every obstacle to find its way. That was the gift Thomas and Penelope left behind. Not just property or wealth, though there was that. Not just family, though the family was large and loving, but the gift of belief, of understanding that love is worth the sacrifice, that some moments define everything that comes after, that choosing to fight for someone is choosing to build a future. And so, the story ended where all the best love stories end, not with death, but with legacy. Not with separation, but with eternal connection. Not with regret, but with the certain knowledge that every moment, every sacrifice, every drop of blood shed was worth it for the life that followed. Thomas had dug through a mountain to reach Penelope, but in the end, what he found was not just her, but himself, his purpose, his home. And that made every scarred palm, every bleeding finger, every exhausted hour worth more than gold. Their love had been tested in the crucible of crisis and had emerged stronger. It had been built on a foundation of determination and sacrifice, and it had lasted, bright and true, until the very end and beyond. That was the story of Thomas and Penelope Fairmont. That was the legacy they left. And it would endure, passed down through generations. A reminder that the greatest love stories are not always easy, but they are always, always worth it.